This is the second and final panel for our program today. And I have to admit, I've really been looking forward to this one for quite a while. When I was thinking about what to do that would focus on the ANOPR, I couldn't help, as I was going through it, thinking, what I thought would happen at the commission back when I was there with these types of issues. And the more I thought about it, I figured, what better source to go to than those who have actually had to deal with these types of issues themselves in the past. So I feel like I've gotten the band back together again to a certain extent, for me at least, even though I know the commissioners here weren't all together at the same time. I had the privilege, at least, of working for or serving all of them during my time at the commission. Really appreciate your taking the time to be here today. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. I've got some questions that I would like to run through them, but at some point I'd like to open it up for questions from the floor. So please start thinking about what you'd like to grill the former commissioners about, and we'll go ahead. Let me first start off by introducing Tony Clark. Tony was a FERC commissioner from 2012 to 2016. He's currently a senior advisor at Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer. Next to Tony is former Commissioner Suedeen Kelly. She served on the commission from 2003 to 2009, and she's currently a partner at Jenner and Block. And then next to Suedeen, we have former Commissioner Marc Spitzer. He was on the commission from 2006 to 2011 and is currently a partner at Steptoe and Johnson. And then we have, at the other end, former Chairman Joe Kelliher. He was at the commission from 2003 to 2009, and he served as chairman from 2005 to 2009. And he's most recently been an executive vice president for federal regulatory affairs for NextEra. So have a great group of extremely experienced and talented individuals to talk about the FERC ANOPR. And what I wanted to start off, at least initially, with all of them and get their perspective on is, having been on the commission and having worked on different large rulemakings, items before the commission that are challenging, like this ANOPR we have before us now, what are some of the lessons learned from those types of items that you worked on while you were at the commission that you think would be important for either the current commission or others to understand about this type of undertaking that FERC is trying to do right now? And I'll start first with Tony. You were most recently, of all this group, been on the commission, so you've got the most recent experience. So let me hear what your perspective is on that.
Sure. Thanks, Larry, and thanks to Wires for the invitation to be here. Like everyone else, it's great to see people in person. I have to tell you, as I got up this morning and put this suit on, this one probably for the first time in, 2 years, there was a moment of kind of apprehension as I went to
we all know where you're coming from, believe me.
to buckle it up, and I was very pleased to find that it still fits. It might have taken a little, extra suck in, but that was a good check for me. So good to be back in downtown for the first time in a while. In terms of your question, while I'm the most recent, in thinking about it, it occurs to me that in some ways I'll be interested to hear what some of my colleagues say, because in terms of the really big orders that we sometimes think about, whether it's 636 or 890 or 888, or even Order 1000, in the case of Order 1000, it was just before I got onto the commission. So the term that I happened to be there was a little bit more care and feeding of some of the really big orders, compliance filings and things like that, but not orders.
So you have no fingerprints on those items, at least.
That's
right?
Exactly right. Yeah, I can't be held responsible. But I do think there are some takeaways, even in the context of some of the more discrete issues that we were dealing with for the 4.5 years that I was there. First of all, to the degree you can, keep it focused on concrete things that are squarely within the commission's jurisdiction and that you have a very good grasp on, and then move forward first with those kind of things. To the degree orders start to push the bounds of that and to get into more either controversial or nebulous areas, you're increasing the chance you're going to have those dissenting votes in orders. And I think it is best, as you referenced earlier, I think in one of the questions, the durability of orders is important, and to the degree you can cobble together 5-0 votes, that's good for the commission and it's good for the industry. So keeping things focused on concrete, achievable outcomes is important in any order. Two, in terms of transmission and transmission planning, something that I've talked about for a long time, and I talked about on the Hill in congressional testimony this summer, is try to focus on bottoms-up planning. Now, that bottoms-up planning happens in the context of an iterative process of looking what happens in greater regions and across regional lines. But I do think from a customer standpoint, because states are the one jurisdiction that have actual authority over the end-use retail customer perspective, both in terms of jurisdiction and expertise, that building those things from the bottom up is a much more durable way to get transmission planning done. That was one of the lessons, I think, coming out of the MVP suite of projects that we had in MISO and in the upper Midwest that I was a part of at the time that I was on the state commission. I think the reason it was successful is because you had such buy-in at the state level starting out and then moving up. And so that's certainly a takeaway. And then a final sort of bit of advice that I'd have would be, as FERC promulgates rules, make sure that you're not fighting the different constructs with the rules. Or maybe put a different way, don't try to avoid pounding square pegs into round holes. That's sometimes, I think, where some rules have become more challenging or less successful maybe than others. I think that, to me, that's one of the lessons coming out of Order 1000. In some ways, especially speaking from someone who comes from one of that sort of 3/4 of the states in the country that still have vertically integrated utilities, imposing the competition mandates on top of a system which is really designed around vertically integrated utilities in a lot of states was always a bit of an ill fit, and I think has caused some of the challenges with Order 1000. In the same context, understand for those regions that are working within RTOs and working with markets, make sure that the transmission planning that may come out of this and might be beefed up out of it takes place understanding the construct of the market itself, and make sure that you're doing things that aren't conflicting with or fighting the very market that has been set up, because at a certain point one or the other fails. You don't get the transmission and the planning that you need, or you're degrading the market itself. So those would be my sort of big picture pieces of advice.
Great, thanks. Well, Suedeen, I know you were there while some of these major rules were getting pushed out through the commission, so you can't take Tony's dodge on this one, but I'd like to get your thoughts on what your experience was with those types of major rules.
Sure, and I want to start out by saying hello to everyone, and I was glad I had the opportunity to visit with a number of you last evening, and it's just great to see everybody again. And I also want to acknowledge that Joe was my chairman, not for my entire tenure at FERC, and he was in charge, and we were in charge of implementing the Energy Policy Act, which resulted in, I don't know how many,
18,
Joe, 30?
18?
Not that many?
We had
32
We had 58
tasks.
rules that were EPACT and non-EPACT. So we had 58 rules.
58.
One was vacated, and I'm still mad about that one.
The rest of us have forgotten about that one. So we did have quite an experience, and Marc served on that commission as well with me. We had quite an experience, and I'm just going to give you my reflections from a broad range of experiences, good and bad. So some of my takeaways are, the more focused the rulemaking is, the easier it is. This is not a focused rulemaking. However, the less focused it is, the more important it is to go through the rulemaking process, and the harder it is. I recall two rules, broad rules, that we attempted to get through FERC, one successfully and one unsuccessfully. The first one was standard market design. That was Chairman Wood's baby, and Joe and I joined the commission, and I think it was dead in the water at that point, pretty much dead in the water, but still on the books. And that's an example of a not focused rule. It had a goal, but it was big and unwieldy and frankly unpopular, and that didn't happen. Having said that, I don't think you could have achieved standard market design any other way. Because there are two ways to make policy, a rule or a case-by-case basis. So sometimes you just don't have an alternative. If you want to try and make policy on a case-by-case basis, you can do it if what you want is to make incremental policy in small steps. But if you want to do what this commission apparently wants to do, I don't think there's any alternative to doing what they did. The other was Order 890, and that was a big rulemaking and very successful. And I think back on it, one of the reasons I'll be interested in Marc and Joe's perspective on it, one of the reasons that it was successful is because I think there was a consensus, not just among the commissioners, but within the industry, that there was a problem that needed to be solved, and we needed a solution. So one of the questions I asked myself about this rulemaking is there a consensus that this is a problem that needs to be solved? And I suspect that people will vary in their response to that question. The other point that I wanted to make as I started thinking about our tenure was the rulemakings we didn't embark on. Renewable energy started to become a big issue when we were on the commission. And we had problems, big problems, and you all still do, I think, with the queue. And in Joe and my talking about it, what are we going to do to help solve this problem? And my recollection is that that I was pushing for rulemaking, and Joe said, you know, it's a big problem. It's a little bit different in every RTO. It's going to take a long time. We're not going to be around to see it through. So let's try and do it on a case-by-case basis. So those are some of my thinkings of how it was back in the day. For what it's worth today, one other point I wanted to make, that in these rulemakings, especially the big ones, the most important party is staff. It's a huge undertaking for them. We're lucky that FERC has an incredible staff. And this one is a big burden. It's going to be a big burden. I am sure if you ask them, they wouldn't say it's a burden, but it's a big job. Having teed that up, if I were your lawyer, what I would say is that you should not only use the comments as a way to effectively advocate your position, but you should go to talk to staff, because they're going to have a lot of comments to read and sift through and create a record around, and it's going to be hard to get all those into one collective mind, but even harder to decide what are the most important things. And of course, you know what the most important things are, and so don't tell staff I said this, but go talk to staff about what you want to accomplish. That's it. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Suedeen. As former FERC staff, I can confirm that these big rulemakings are a big burden on staff. No question about it. And you know, behind most of the major rulemakings that FERC came out, they all have numbers designated to them, whether 888, 2000, Order 1000, and there's some story behind how that number came to be, which brings me to you, Marc, because FERC legend, or FERC lore at least, is that you were responsible for Order number 1000 being named Order number 1000. I'm not going to ask you to confirm or deny that, but I know you had experience dealing with that rulemaking, so maybe you can talk a little bit more about what your perspective is on that type of a large rulemaking.
Okay. Maybe Maybe that's best for the cocktail hour.
Okay,
And well, Larry, first I want to thank you, and I want to thank Wires for this event. It took about return to normalcy. There's no substitute for personal interaction. And I've been prudently and safely traveling the last couple of months, and had, in the last 2 weeks, went to a couple of weddings out west, which are joyous celebrations that were put off for a year and a half. And to see from the children to the adults, the return of personal interaction, it bodes well for society, and I'm hoping that it'll proceed. And it also will bode well for government, because as you know, we're in an unprecedented time of polarization, and I don't know if the drivers of the polarization will abate, but the tone and tenor of the discussion is better when you look people in the eye. So I thank you for this event, Larry. I'd also like to thank the Wires members. You know, the transmission grid is one of the wonders of the world. It's the envy of nations, and the challenge of building and maintaining the transmission grid in the United States is underestimated. And that's part of the challenge that goes into the proceeding that's in front of us and goes into the past proceedings. And so I'd like to offer some perspectives just on the focus on goals and objectives. And Suedeen had it absolutely right when she said, what problem are you trying to solve? When I was in the state Senate, when I was a majority leader in Arizona, I had an old Marine colonel, and when I give him the sign, thumbs down, he'd raise his hand in the caucus on bills and say, Mr. Majority Leader, what problem is this piece of legislation intending to solve? Which was a sign that this bill was dead. But it's important to focus on that, and Suedeen was absolutely right about that. And then the other aspect from my experience is, again, largely on Order 1000, is changed circumstances, and then finally unintended consequences. So those are the advice that I would give to the stakeholders as well as to the commissioners and staff, is to be mindful of those three issues. And in the context of Order 1000, I will say, early in my career in the private sector, after I left FERC, I had a new client who was a lovely, very bright woman, my direct report, and she says to me, regarding Order 1000, dude, what were you thinking? So to briefly articulate at least what I was thinking in the context of particularly of the objectives, the way Order 1000, the origin of Order 1000 was, in my view, in the 2008 election, the Obama-McCain, where the Democrats won the White House and Barack Obama got, I think, 53%. It was quite substantial victory over my friend in that year, and a Democratic House and a filibuster-proof Democratic Senate. And so I was expecting cap-and-trade legislation to evolve, which would radically change the transmission grid, the fuel mix, and it was one of the motivators for Order 1000. And then I was aware, as a lot of people in this room know, Susan Tomasky had those maps of the 400 kV DC lines going from North Dakota into New York, and how do we accommodate that? And the fact of the matter is, the system worked pretty well. The status quo in 2008 worked pretty well for a utility, particularly a vertically integrated utility, within one service territory, and certainly within one jurisdiction, building transmission from a discrete plant to load. And that obviously would change if those Susan Tomasky maps were to come to fruition. How do you deal with large interregional projects, of course, multiple jurisdictions, with multiple transmission owners and potentially competitors dealing with transmission that's generation that's yet to be built? So that was the problem that we were seeking to solve in Order 1000. And of course, circumstances change. And during the course of the rulemaking, there were other objectives. There was microgrid, there was distributed generation. There was, in the wake of the Great Recession, of 2008 a decline in load. There was an increase in energy efficiency. There was that caused load to drop. So you had PJM, I think was discussed earlier, a number of projects were canceled that had been planned. So these change in circumstances were difficult to assimilate into the rulemaking and would require quite a bit of dexterity in terms of how you analyze. So the bogey changed, the target changed, the objective changed. And then in terms of the governance issue, and Tony very articulately addressed that in terms of durability, you like to have consensus. And it's often difficult to achieve a consensus. But some degree of consensus is better than an implosion and a diffusion. And too much dissenting or even concurring opinions cast, a dissent cast as a concurring opinion could also be counterproductive, particularly on review to the Court of Appeals, and unsettling to an industry, particularly bulk transmission, that requires enormous investment. And my thought process, in Order 1000, I broke from my friend and Republican colleague, Commissioner Phil Moeller, and I voted with the majority and was able to work on some amendments that made the order more palatable to me. And I guess it came from my state legislative background, which is, and Tony knows this well, it's his background as well. If you're going to offer an amendment, you have to vote for the bill. And would you rather get 50% of nothing as opposed to 100% of nothing? And so that led me in both Order 745 and Order 1000 to vote with the Democratic majority in light of trying to seek some regulatory certainty and achieve some degree of consensus, as opposed to sticking to my guns and holding out for the perfect. And the old saying is the perfect is the enemy of the good, and I believe that's the case in rulemaking as well as legislation and arguably in life. So I guess at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that the political landscape is far different now, presently, than it was back in 2008, and for a lot of reasons that have been exhaustively described in chronicles, and not just politics but society. The degree of polarization makes governance extremely difficult. Nevertheless, I am optimistic on this, as if assuming, and I fully believe that the commissioners that voted for the ANOPR to be instituted will continue to work diligently on this. There will be an effort at consensus building, and I agree with what Tony and Suedeen said, that sometimes less is more, the fewer ultimate objectives may lead to more discrete and accurate rulemaking, and gets that consensus and regulatory certainty that the industry craves. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
So Joe, you are unique among this group in that you were not only a commissioner, you were chairman for a period of time. You got to try to shepherd through some pretty significant rules, including implementation of EPAC 2005 and Order 890. How is that different from just being a commissioner? What are the takeaways from that perspective on something like this?
Yeah, I mean, there are some differences just in terms of timing, really. Okay, as we said, we issued 58 rules when I was chairman. Many of them were driven by EPAC, and they had deadlines. And I asked the staff in the beginning, can we meet these deadlines? Because if so, let's do it, because Congress would be impressed. And if not, we'll tell them the ones that we can't. But then there were also discretionary rulemakings, like 890. And there, I thought it was really important I've always thought 85% of FERC's workload is driven by filings that come in the door that you can't anticipate. So if you have a discretionary agenda, it can't be too big, because if it's too big, that creates backlog and sloppy orders in the routine business of the agency. So we thought okay, if we're going to have discretionary rulemakings, let's not do too much at the same time. Let's kind of phase it in over time. And we were really efficient. We didn't put out trial balloons. We spent a lot of time up front identifying the nature of the problem that the commission might want to address, defining that problem, coming up with possible solutions before anything was issued, before an NOI or an NOPR or a NOPR was issued. In part because we wanted to look at the end game. If we start something and you look at the solutions, none of them are jurisdictional, or the jurisdictional action can't possibly solve the problem you've teed up, then what's the point of the exercise? So we, I think, thought about endgame a lot. And like the resilience proceeding that FERC issued, in January 2018, we never would have issued that. I mean, because you just look at the end game, you knew that there was nothing that FERC was going to do that could possibly contribute to whatever resiliency is supposed to mean so that, we never would have done that, because that just seems pure waste. And we also wanted to make sure that whatever action the commission would take would be effective and also withstand judicial review. So those are some core design principles, if you will, whenever we decided to take action. So we spent a lot of time before we'd issue an NOI or NOPR. Those weren't just random questions, and we weren't just pitching questions to the outside world. We would have thought about it, I think, a lot more. And if you would look at, say, the 890 NOI that was issued in September or October of 2005, I think it was pretty concrete. It wasn't just hundreds of trial balloons. I do think that the ANOPR is a noble effort, and I particularly really commend that they're trying to integrate interconnection with regional planning and cost allocation, because to a large extent the grid for the last 10 years has been built out on the backs of interconnection customers, not so much by transmission planning. So I think that I like that overarching goal. Now, if you look at what the ANOPR is doing, though, it's reforming or revising Order 890, Order 1000, Order 2003 in one fell swoop. So to me, I'm trapped in a linear mind, so it made me look at, well, how were those rules developed? I knew a bit about 890, I knew less about the others. They all took 17 to 21 months from the first step, whether that be an NOI or an ANOPR. 17 to 21 months for the process. It took 6 to 8 months between the first step, whether it be an NOI or ANOPR, to get to a NOPR, and then it took 9 to 15 months to go from NOPR to final rule. So those are pretty substantial timelines. I also looked at 845, because that was the last time Order 2003 was revised. That took 34 months to be completed. So, it will be a challenge. It will be a challenge to revise all three of those rules at the same time. It doesn't mean it can't be done. Significantly, all three of those major rules had a high level of cohesion, unanimity among the commission. I mean, I thought Phil dissented on Order 1000, but I thought it was a partial dissent. I don't think he dissented from the whole thing.
Correct.
So I thought all of them were unanimous votes, except Order 1000, I would say, is like a 4.5 to half, like a 4.5 to 0.5. So it was a high level of cohesion on many of the issues. Now, to go from the ANOPR to the final rule, I mean, there are challenges. The ANOPR, if you really look at it, to me, it's really much more of an NOI than an ANOPR, right? Because an NOI, if you look at the first step the commission could take is an NOI, an ANOPR, or NOPR. A NOPR you issue when you're really sure you've identified the problem and you have concrete proposals to address that problem. An NOI is, you're not sure there's a problem, you think there might be a problem, you really don't have much of an idea of what the solution is. You ask questions. It's very heavy on questions, very light on proposals. And an ANOPR is in between, but it usually has proposals. The ANOPR asks literally hundreds of questions, and some of them are extremely high level, 30, 50,000 foot questions. There are some proposals in there, but because of the concurrences, it's hard to say that those are commission proposals. Because if the ANOPR really is an NOI, it's actually very hard to dissent from an NOI. How can you dissent from a question being asked? there is much more division, apparent division among the commissioners than was true for 890, Order 1000, and Order 2003, and I think certainly true also for 888 and other major rulemakings. There also might be changes in the commission, right? There will be one change when I hope Chairman Phillips is confirmed. I think he's really well qualified. I have great regard for him. But there's another nomination proceeding. Every year a commissioner's term comes up, so there might be a change next year, or at least a renomination fight. Also, the commission, as I said, I think the commission really shouldn't try to overload on discretionary agendas. So where does the ANOPR rank among commission priorities? Is it number one? Are there other number ones? I get the sense there's at least 3 or 4 number ones. And again, I'm trapped in a linear mind that just causes my head to explode. Like, there can only be one number one, seriously. But they're also looking at capacity markets, revising all the capacity markets and all the RTOs. They're looking at reforming the gas certificate policy statement. They've been looking at that since January of 18, I think. And they're also looking at GHG mitigation. To me, if all of those are number ones, that makes it really hard for the ANOPR to go to a crisp proposed rule and crisp final rule. I frankly think the worst possible outcome would be to slap together a NOPR that's rushed and then issue a final rule that's also not enough time is taken on the final rule, under the logic of, well, we'll fix it on rehearing. That's an expression within FERC that I hate and despise. And I never wanted to do that. So that, to me, that would be the worst possible outcome. I would really hope the commission wouldn't do that. I would hope they would not be driven by an arbitrary deadline, because it's so much better to spend the time, sweat the details to get out a really good proposed rule. And then perhaps the final rule could be issued, relatively quickly. That's what I would do, is I'd spend a lot of time on the proposed rule. And just to comment, Suedeen mentioned the queue. I remember meeting with her and she said, Joe, we really have to act on the queue. And I'm a Star Trek fan, and if you're a Star Trek fan, Q is a mischievous character, a mischievous alien character. And I'm like, I don't think she's talking about him. And I basically said, look, I have no idea what you're talking about. And you had just come from a MISO meeting, I think, and they had like a 350-year backlog in their queue. And so we talked about how to approach it. And just because the RTO rules were so different, we did have a technical conference. It was Suedeen's initiative. And we issued an odd order on technical conference. Right. But it basically was pretty much directing the RTOs, make filings or we're going to 206 you. Yeah. And they all did. They made multiple filings. So the approach, I think, did work. I think it did work. And one comment on the number issue is the only time I ever did that was on 890, right? Because we went out of sequence for 890. But I thought, well, we're building on 888. Right? We're building on 88, so it just seemed a number close to 888 made sense to me. But once some execs from National Grid were visiting, and I was telling them about this convention where you sometimes pluck a number out of sequence, and my father used to always talk about 1066, the Battle of Hastings. And if you're Irish, you kind of like Hastings because the last time England was defeated and by invaders. And so I told the execs from National Grid I was thinking about 1066, and they exploded in laughter. And the Americans were like, I don't get the joke. I mean, but we did skip. I did skip orders. I did skip 666, so that's still there for someone to use. Because that was. That would have been the Puka repeal final rule, and I didn't want the Puka lovers to exult in the sign of it. But I kept it in my back pocket in case Suedeen and my fellow commissioners rolled me on something. I'd put the sign of the beast on a final rule that I dissented from.
We were on to you, though.
Anyway, those are my thoughts, my initial thoughts.
See, I told you there are stories behind these order numbers. I really wasn't kidding about that. So, well, there's so many different aspects of what's encompassed in this ANOPR. It's almost hard to figure out what to focus on. But I'm trying to think about sort of large themes that you could all weigh in on. And one of them is, I think, at a minimum, the potential for state-federal conflict over some of the issues, whether it's cost allocation or some of the others. Commissioner Clements acknowledged that, talked about the need for collaboration. FERC has started this effort on a joint task force, and the first meeting on that's coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm curious, and I know three of you have experience at state commissions as well as being at FERC. What your thoughts are, and how is FERC going to navigate one of the major issues that could sink the whole thing in terms of these state-federal conflicts over transmission processes, cost allocation, all of that. So just a simple question. And I'll start with you, Suedeen, if you don't mind. And
Sure,
work
and I'm
through.
going to sidestep a direct answer and give some background. And one of the beauties of the ANOPR in all of its messiness is that it did put a lot of things on the table. And it is an ANOPR, it's not an OPR. So depending on how the commission approaches it, and with your comments, I think will be particularly effective, they have the opportunity to narrow those issues down to a more manageable set where they can get consensus. And for all of you who have been involved in the legislative process, whether it's in the legislature or whether it's at FERC or at your state commissions, there's a lot to be said for putting, if you have multiple decision makers, a lot of things on the table and making it a big pie so that if you can work collaboratively, you can get something. Somebody can get something and you can try and put them together. So, I mean, it's possible that that will go out as something that's too difficult to get.
Right.
And another point, not answering your question. I'm going to let Tony answer your question. Another
Coming to you
point
next, Tony.
is if you look at the ANOPR, yeah, there are a lot of issues out there, but there are some that are not teed up that I think are just as difficult and just potential hurdles if your goal is to build more transmission. And calling out the federal state jurisdiction, a controversy is one that's not called out. I don't know that I would call it out, but I just wanted to put it out there. Another one is the pressure that's going to be put on state commissions and commissioners to cite transmission. That's as you all know, right? You deal with that all the time. I remember being chair of a state commission. The cases that I really hated were transmission citing cases. Rate cases were difficult with your relationship with the governor and the legislature and the consumers, but transmission citing cases were really terrible. So that hasn't been teed up. To the extent that new transmissions brings renewables to market, we're really not talking, I guess, in most cases about economic transmission. We're talking about additive transmission. Transmission lines, as you know, are expensive, and long lines are very expensive. If this is our goal across the country, maybe we should talk about what that's going to cost. And I think the one other is to the extent that maybe it's almost unintended consequences, but to the extent that new transmission changes the competitive playing field for generation, that's a problem too. It's not necessarily a problem, it's a challenge. And it's a hurdle to getting new transmission built if you're going to upset the status quo and you're going to have winners and losers in the related markets. And that's not in the ANOPR. It'll be interesting to see if any of those get added or what gets subtracted.
Right.
So I'm gonna pass this federal state jurisdictional issue to Tony, if that's okay
So
with
Tony,
you.
Suedeen's dumped this one on your lap. You're a former president of NARUC. We've got this process going on. What are your thoughts in terms of how to navigate this? And actually, what do you see as coming out of this task force process they've got?
Sure. So I tend to divide cost allocation and planning into two different jurisdictional buckets. With regard to cost allocation on the interstate grid, I mean, FERC clearly has authority. It is within its jurisdiction. Now that can cause political challenges for the states. I mean, probably the first time that I ever set foot in 888 was actually on this issue when I was a state commissioner, and it had to do with cost allocation. I think all three of you may have been on the commission at the time. It was it was what came to be known as the otter tail problem, which is you had it was in my home state, in the upper Midwest, you had thousands of megawatts in the queue looking to be sited in the otter tail zone. And the way the cost allocation split was at the time, it was a 50-50 share between the local zone and the system. And of course the problem was none of those interconnections were being built to serve anyone in that particular zone. I mean, you would have had unbelievable costs dumped on one particular utility's customers, and it was, I mean, on the face of it, it was a huge problem, and to the point that you had utilities saying they would leave the RTOs if you impose that kind of cost impact. And the FERC process worked. I mean, the state commissioners and others brought the issue to attention, and it was eventually resolved. It's not to say it's going to be easy, but cost allocation is clearly within that FERC wheelhouse. Planning has always been a little bit more difficult in my mind because you're sitting right at the edge of the FERC and state jurisdiction, especially when you're talking about those vertically integrated parts of the country where the transmission plan is a product of the integrated resource planning that utilities do, which means there are choices that the utility company and the state commission are making about, do we site a new line? Is our solution transmission and distant renewables, or is it some other generation that's sited closer to load? And those are all decisions that are made in the context usually of litigated proceedings in front of state commissions, but you're right up at that edge where it makes it a bit more difficult, and I think will be a challenge for the commission, and has been inherent in all the challenges the commission has had with things like Order 1000, where it kind of straddles that line of the FERC process trying to be informed by the state process, but the state taking into consideration what FERC is requiring utilities to do in terms of regional and interregional planning. On the issue of permitting, I should say one more thing about cost allocation. Cost allocation, while also being squarely in FERC's wheelhouse, I don't know that we need new congressional legislation to deal with things like cost allocation. I mean, coming out of, again, the MISO MVP order and what's been upheld by the courts in terms of roughly commensurate benefits, those are really wide goalposts that the federal courts have set. And if you can't kick it between those, you may have a project that has problems on it. All the courts have said is you don't have to go chasing pennies or even millions of dollars, but you got to do some quantification of the costs and benefits and allocate them commensurate. So I think that FERC has a fair amount of flexibility in that. With permitting, of course, that would take congressional action if FERC was going to get involved with that. The backstop siting has basically been neutered at this point. I believe that the bipartisan bill has some transmission permitting reform. As someone who sat both on a state commission and a FERC commission, I would be a little terrified of it if I was on FERC at this point, the way that it's set up. Because what it says is, on one of these lines that have been drawn as a transmission corridor that FERC may be eligible to site, the state gets a 1-year shot at it. And regardless of what the state does, that developer has a right to go to FERC to overrule the state. I would not want to be staff going into those field hearings where you have a line that a state has determinatively denied for whatever reason, cultural, historic, resources, environmental, private property rights, whatever, and then having to go in and overrule state and local permitting. I think it sets the commission up to be in a very bad spot. But permitting will continue to be a challenge. The other thing I'd say about permitting is, from those of us who have served in either Western or Midwestern states that have federal lands, we know that just simply bumping permitting up to the federal level has not been a really great way to get transmission line siting done in parts of the country where it's actually the federal government that's the problem, not the state commission in getting permitting done.
So Marc, looking at that joint federal-state task force that's coming up, what do you look at that and see as the outcome of the effort that FERC's undertaking, and what would be a success for that, do you think?
Well, I think building on some of the prior comments, in a discrete litigated matter at FERC, an order with a set of facts, it's easier to find solutions than in a generic rulemaking. And some of the successes that we've had in resolving tensions between the feds and the states have been in those discrete orders. I point out first, I didn't illuminate on those famous maps from 2008, but the people in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania were not wildly enthusiastic, as you might imagine, about those 400 kV DC lines, to the point that I think it was in 2007, I was at a conference and I ran across the superintendent of the Gettysburg battlefield, which was not far from where I went to college in central Pennsylvania. And he made a comment about the lines going through Gettysburg battlefield. And Joe, you probably know precisely how many people were killed during the 3 days between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863. But he said this is going to be worse if you build a power line through the Gettysburg Monument. And at least in a litigated matter, you have the opportunity to have some degree of flexibility and compromise in the settlement of a contested case, where the parties feel they get something. And this is sort of the pros and the cons of this. In the MVP, we heard a little bit about the MVP, which received quite a bit of plaudits from the MISO stakeholders. And there were disputed issues, but they were largely resolved. And I think some of you can correct me if you think we're wrong, that those orders have stood the test of time in terms of federal state. Nevertheless, and now we're testing the memory banks, and maybe you get thin-skinned when you're in government sometimes. Who remembers some really negative Wall Street Journal editorials about MVP that came out in 2010? Anybody? All right. I would run into people in the metro and say, Spitz, what the hell's going on? Because they were conservative Republican. The Wall Street Journal? Turns out there's a certain individual who you can talk to me later about his identity. I invited him down to FERC, and I said, what do you know about transmission? And it turns out nothing. But there was somebody who put a bee in his bonnet, who was opposed to the MVP projects, and he wrote editorials that were utterly, outrageously wrong. And there was no transparency in where the information came from on the editorial page. But the orders themselves were the product of reasoned decision-making. I think some of them were appealed, and the Court of Appeals rejected challenges, and the process worked. So the MVP worked. But even in the process works, there will still be aggrieved people who feel disadvantaged. And the way I learned this from tax legislation, if you raise taxes and reduce taxes in the same bill, the people whose taxes are increased will complain 100 times compared with the gratitude expressed by those whose taxes are reduced. And so in the cost allocation issues, somebody pays more, somebody pays less. We're going to hear from those who pay more. That's the nature of the beast. But discrete orders is a way, I think, of solving that state-federal tension.
So I want to pivot a little bit to a slightly different topic that came up earlier, both with Commissioner Clements and on the last panel, and that is the topic of competition. It's not a major focus within the ANOPR, but I do think it's actually turned out to be a fairly significant amount of focus in the comments that came in. And I'm just curious, Joe, starting with you, what are your thoughts in terms of how competition on transmission has impacted either positively or negatively transmission development? And is this an issue that FERC should re-examine? And if they do, what should they do about it?
Sure. I mean, I think competition has proved to be successful in transmission development as well as in other areas. There are cases, say, in New York. I mean, this is a case where NextEra had a project that was competing with a New York project proposed by the incumbents. Sorry, Stu, if you're here, still here. But the NextEra project, I think, cost 1/4 as much as the incumbent project, and it was electrically equivalent. It was really order of magnitude. It wasn't a close call. And so there are examples like that where that's tremendous, that shows the success of competition. But going back over the last 10 or 15 years, only about 3% of RTO and ISO transmission has been exposed to competition. And the threat of competition, I think, causes incumbents to build local projects instead of regional projects. So it really means you have to make an adult decision. What is relatively more important? Is it getting more regional transmission projects built? If so, competition is a threat to that. Or is it policing cost overruns? Which is more important? And there was a moment in September of 2019, FERC initiated on its own motion 3 206s against SPP, PJM, and MISO, looking at the limits they have on competition. FERC was proposing to lower those limits to allow more competition, transmission in those regions. FERC ended up, and I thought, wow, that's shocking, right? Because you don't ask that question unless you're pretty sure you're going to act, I think. But I guess I'm someone who likes to think about endgame before you start something. But they started that, asking these questions, looking at allowing more competition to these 3 RTOs. A few months later, they closed it without taking any action. So that, once they closed that without taking any action, to me that was a sign that the Commission has no appetite for trying to expand competition. So is that 3% cost discipline worth discouraging regional transmission? I don't think so. So I actually was a little surprised the ANOVER didn't propose eliminating competition in the hopes that that by itself would result in more incumbents proposing regional projects. Because and I'm not trying to be critical of incumbents. Utility regulation means it's perfectly rational for a utility to prefer to have 100% certainty of building the smaller local project than competing for the larger project that competition they might not win. So I think utilities are acting perfectly rationally. Recognizing that, I think it's better on balance to eliminate competition, even though I consider myself a big supporter of it.
So Marc, looking back at Order 1000, do you have any thoughts on revisiting the issue of competition? And if so, what should the Commission think about doing?
Well, one of the interesting aspects of that, and now my memory banks were jogged, I think Commissioner Moeller's concern with Order 1000 was the ROFR.
Yeah. I think so.
Yep.
And
it had to do with the reliability projects, I think, in the context.
Yeah. As it happened, the ROFR discussion, particularly at the end of the rulemaking, took all the oxygen out of the room. The incumbent utilities particularly were demonstrative about that. And I didn't feel that the ROFR, I thought maybe it was 5% of the sum and substance of the order, and yet 95% of the comments were on the ROFR. And so that did not help the process. And it led me again to revisit the question. We have 888 on the books, and the Commission has been over a large time horizon, 40-year horizon, directionally moving towards increased competition in generation and transmission, perfected by discrete orders. Is it not worthwhile to consider individual cases to advance that cause, given we have 888 on the books? And there is, I understand the criticism of the incumbents. At the same time, the incumbents are accused of withholding transmission to benefit their existing generation. And then the incumbents are accused of overbuilding transmission. I would think both cannot be true at the same time. Certainly not in the same case. And if we have a focused litigated proceeding as opposed to a generic rulemaking, perhaps we can come to some resolution, again, on an RTO by RTO basis.
Suedeen, you have any thoughts on this issue?
I think competition could work better if the process was better. And I say that because of looking at the success that Texas had with CREZ. And if you look at what Texas did with CREZ and why it appeared to be a not only technological success, but a political success, is that Texas planned the transmission for the whole state. And it put out there for competition in one process a lot of transmission, enabling a lot of different competitors to get involved one time, and they were pretty astute in dividing up pieces of the project to give to different competitors. What do? We didn't do that. I mean, just to begin with, in theory at least, we could have, if we wanted to introduce competition, I'm not blaming you, Marc, is to start countrywide, at least with all the RTOs, and do a transmission planning process across the RTOs, set out a lot of projects, have one process, so you don't have the transaction costs of having to figure out everybody's process and go through all of the processes, and and award, and maybe award pieces so that lots of different competitors get the project. So I think it could be done better with a better process.
Tony, I know you've given a lot of thought to this issue, and you get the final word on it. What's the answer? Should FERC...
I do think it should revisit it, and it comes down to that square peg and round hole issue, that especially in certain regions of the country, and understanding that there are regional variations on this, and not every region sees it the same way, but at least in those vertically integrated regions of the country, that sort of competition model was, as I said before, was always kind of this odd fit where, to Joe's point, I mean, if you're a utility who is franchised to serve an entire area, you work with your state utility commission to come to an integrated resource plan, you do all of those things in the context of an Order 1000 mandate, where once you have a penny of regional cost allocation, all of a sudden all those lines that you would have otherwise built get bid out. You sort of throw up your hands and say, well, why am I going through all this work on my state regulatory, with the state regulatory commission, building the case, doing the integrated resource planning, if ultimately I'm not going to have an opportunity to build that line? So I think it caused an internal tension that's been hard to come over. And I mean, and the commission has known about this for a while. Chairman Chatterjee had spoke about looking at Order 1000, and maybe it should be revised at some point. But I think everyone always kind of recognized that there were, while there was widespread agreement that Order 1000 wasn't working, there were two ways to deal with it, and at least with this competition issue, and there's not been consensus around which way to tackle it. One school of thought is, all right, you turn down the screws even tighter on competition policy, and you impose that kind of bidding bureaucracy at lower and lower levels, driving it towards the distribution grid. In my opinion, that imposes even more bureaucracy and even fights the model harder than fights the existing construct more than the current one. Or the other model is you take a step back, and perhaps in some regions of the country you recognize that kind of competition mandate really doesn't work in that region, and you take the foot off the brake a little. I think that's the better route. I enjoyed Suedeen's comments about CREZ, because I think in some ways, in the back of people's minds, things like CREZ and MVP are maybe what they have in mind with where this all may go. An outstanding question that I have about it that I don't have a great answer to, I just think it's a challenge the commission will have to address, is, again, talking about how certain concepts can fight the construct. I mean, if you look at CREZ, I mean, Texas is held out as, the energy-only market, and here's where price signals determine what gets built and what gets shut down. I mean, CREZ was anything but a market, concept. It was state government coming in and saying $7 billion worth of lines are going to get built, and they were competitively bid out. But that had a lot of impacts on the ERCOT market, right? Because you've just taken the biggest cost for one resource class, uplifted it to the market, and sort of agnostic of price. And that's going to have an impact on LMP and capacity retention and all sorts of things. I don't know what the answer to it is, but there's a tension there between how RTOs have been built around pure price to determine when generation gets built, when transmission gets built, because there's a constraint, all of those sorts of things, and sort of the widely socialized cost model.
So I'll pause for a minute and see if there are any questions from any of the attendees. This is a rare opportunity to ask for former FERC commissioners, one chairman, anything about the ANOPR. Don't pass it up. There you go.
Chris Adlow from Grid United. Question on transmission expansion. And Tony, to your comment, when you build a line between two states, it's kind of easy to quantify the benefits for one state and the other. But when you start going 3 states and that state in the middle gets nothing, it's very easy for that state to deny that line. So how do we get transmission that is multi-state built? Just kind of thoughts.
Sure. I mean, the best example that I can give, and it's been mentioned a couple times, is the MISO MVP suite of projects, where not every state benefited as much, arguably, but every state got something out of it. So, I mean, that was part of the secret sauce of making it work, is that you had to prove that that every state's customers were in a better off position than they would have been without these lines. Now, there's always going to be folks who get the ruler out, on the spreadsheet and try to figure out exactly what their costs and benefits are compared to others' costs and benefits. But if you can at least quantify and prove that everyone's better off, then I think that helps solve that problem.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that one? Just leave it up to Tony.
Just that, and Tony's right, and I'd add SPP to that formulation with the highway byway. SPP would go through a process that was iterative, and at one point I think I talked to Nick Brown about, it reminded me of doing the state budget and cobbling the votes together. Everybody had to bring something back to their district for a yes vote on the budget. And it was, could be a lengthy process involving numerous meetings. And again, it wasn't, to a gnat's eye, equal, but the sense that the states could bring something back and the regions within those states to satisfy the utilities and the stakeholders and the state regulators. That was the process.
Any other questions? Well, go ahead, Bill.
Hi, Bill White, CTC Global. Thanks, everybody. Great discussion. So our company makes a advanced high-performance technology conductor, and there are others in the room who do the same thing. So a couple of things in this ANOPR that strike me. One has to do with incentives for technology, so there's a discussion of that. And then this more broad cost of benefits and costs and competition, so there's really 3. So what we think about is, with our technology, the incentives are interesting. If we counted the benefits and costs properly, we don't need them. We're very confident of that. And we're successful already, and we'd be more successful. So one thing, thinking about what Joe Kelliher said about what would you have FERC do, the question I'd like to get some thoughts on from this group is, if we're in a position to communicate that spending a little more to get a lot more benefit is okay. Competition has in some ways, increased in our view what is sort of an undue emphasis on first costs in the evaluation of transmission solutions in a way that's kind of negatively affects advanced technologies that might cost a little more upfront but provide a lot of benefits. So what is it that the Commission can do? And we think that, there's nothing about 206, just and reasonable rates, that says it has to be achieved only by minimizing first costs, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to solve problems. So my question is, what do you think is in the purview of the Commission to do to communicate to the industry that, hey, there is a lot out there that we can do, and we shouldn't necessarily only focus on first costs. We should have a more balanced view that really delivers greater value over time to ratepayers, which is really what, in our view, 206 is really about and trying to do. So just any thoughts on that would be great.
I tend to think the commission has a wide degree of latitude to take that into consideration, and it's just make sure that you write the rules in the right way that you can. And that's not just limited to FERC. I mean, state commissions generally have similar authority. I mean, sometimes the commissions can be under very restrictive statutory language with regard to least cost planning, and it has to be the absolute, least cost without maybe a little bit broader view. But I think in general, commissions have that ability to weigh certain factors where you're looking for a longer view. It's things like, when you set up a transmission line, do you set it up so you can string a second wire relatively easily? Now that's not an innovative technology, but it's an example of trying to think ahead a little bit so that in the longer run you can save money. And to me, it's just building the record that the commission has and making sure that they give themselves the latitude to be able to take those sort of things into consideration. And the incentive compensation regime is one that has been, the commission has struggled with a little bit to get a really well-defined order that gives direction to the industry. I mean, it was something that for the 4.5 years I was there, I think we debated, and I don't know that we ever came up with a great solution to it, but it's one that's certainly ripe to have some certainty brought to it.
Hey, Larry, just a short comment.
Sure.
I mean, I think technology deployment would benefit from performance-based rates, but the problem is U.S. transmission ownership is so fractured. We have nearly 400 owners, a third of the grid's owned by government, which isn't looking for profit. So it's hard to see, like performance-based rates work really well in the UK, but there you have consolidated ownership and you have a for-profit entity. And I think it's a lot harder to, we looked at it once when at FERC, we had a performance-based rate technical conference. That was my big takeaway, that ownership is just so fractured here that it's hard to see, it's hard to see performance-based rates being successful. But I think that you'd look hard at technology because you'd be looking at overall performance, not the cost of facilities, but performance.
Suedeen?
I agree with both Tony and Joe, and I feel your pain. Because going into a raw competitive process, the benefits that your product and technology can provide could be lost, not recognized. So I think a lot depends on the process. I like Tony's suggestion that it be incentivized and that it be called out as an incentive. I mean, Tony is right. We had a big challenge after EPAC 2005, provided us with the commission with the ability to incentivize as a matter of the statute, although we thought we had the ability to incentivize anyway. But then we tried to do a rule around it, and we couldn't get to a consensus on what we wanted to incentivize. So there might be just a lot of value in having the commission identify technology aspects that they think should be incentivized. At least then it won't necessarily get lost when you make your case for why it should be part of the plan. Of course, in state commissions where there is more interest, at least traditionally, in approaching it through a planning process and through a regulatory mandate process, as opposed to just competitive. There's opportunities there to have it recognized and maybe part of what the state wants to see as part of a transmission plan. It's a challenge.
Marc, you have any thoughts on this one?
Just that there's a silver lining in one of the underlying premises of the ANOPR, which is planning for future generation, specifically discussed, which is a change in the paradigm in terms of the temporal aspect, looking to the future. And it seems that that's a clear policy within the ANOPR that could be built upon and extrapolated to other cases such as yours.
Stu, we're coming down to the end, so you probably get the closeout question. So it's no pressure, but it really better be good. Better be good. So.
No, so it strikes me that for competition, by the way, we have two types of competition that have developed. I don't think the commission was specific in competition, and so some places are solutions-oriented competition where there's more innovation, and some were probably less innovative and more, revenue requirements based on, cost. So I think what I'm hearing is, the cost maybe not worth it. The solutions base, we have innovation, but then we layer in ROFR. And when you get the larger multi-jurisdiction projects, even ROFR, you have a challenge to know when you're crossing franchise territories, how much is each utility going to get? What's the formula there? How do you get agreement on that? And then, so I'm just curious, how do you think about that? And how would you layer in the innovation on solutions that you get from the competitive market in even a ROFR-based process? Because I've seen some of the innovative solutions, and sometimes I even sit back and say, wow, I didn't think of that. So how do we capture the best of what we learned going forward and layer that all together? Heavy duty question maybe, but maybe just some reactions on some of them would be helpful.
Well, maybe another way of asking your question is, how do you reward innovation?
And I probably have a better answer for it when it comes to how to deal with it at the state level than I do from the FERC level. And the reason I say at the state level is that, if, say you have a ROFR issue and franchise utilities have been planning their region and there may have been a cheaper solution to serve customers, then the place to challenge that is in front of the state commission. And the utility has to defend how it decided to plan out the grid. Why did you do this as opposed to, not having a transmission solution to it? And so I think there's a place where you can get to the answer in the record in that case. It's a little tougher for me to conceptualize from a FERC level how to deal with that issue, though.
I'm trapped in a linear mind, so I think if you really, I like the innovative approach of competition, but as long as the incumbent can decide, I'm going to build if I don't like this competitive process, I'm going to build local projects. And I'll build local projects that essentially undermine the need for the regional project. I will do that not because I'm a bad person, because that's the rational thing to do under utility regulation. If you really wanted to have competition, and you wanted to adopt the innovative model nationally, I think you would have to do, FERC would have to exercise its full jurisdiction over transmission that 9 members of the Supreme Court agreed to, require states to unbundle transmission. All transmission is FERC regulated.
So the question is,
Then you could not, then local projects disappear because everything is a FERC project. You have competition for everything.
And if I could add on to that, I think where you'd mentioned the UK model, eventually that leads you to something that FERC had thought long and hard about around the turn of the century, which is grid codes. And do you get to that point where you simply have transmission owning utilities and you recognize that there's a certain degree of market power in that, and then you regulate them like a utility?
Wouldn't it work better if this is going to be my have a dream. My dream is that transmission ownership in the U.S. is structured like gas pipelines. It's all for-profit entities. It's all corporations. There's no government transmission. And you have 12 or 15 or 20 owners of the grid, not 400. Right? I just think it would operate much, much better. But, and I think FERC could do that, could do at least do the first. Well, FERC can't kick TVA and Bonneville and et cetera out of the business of owning transmission. I agree with that, or co-ops or munis. But FERC could require separation, and then the question is, would there naturally be some consolidation? FERC could allow for expedited 203 proceedings for those kinds of consolidations, because if FERC believes that you can't exercise market power if you have a note, then there's no such thing as market power, so mergers would be effortless and quickly approved.
It's a good question to ask at the end.
I was just going to say, nothing like ending on a non-controversial note. So,
The chairman's problem is with James Madison.
Well, but wait a minute, but if FERC has concurrences on the ANOPR, what would the level of cohesion be on what I just laid out? Like, would there be one vote for it or zero?
well, I want to thank all of you for participating on this panel. It's been really interesting from my perspective to hear all of your perspectives, looking back on your past experience and listening to the advice you have for the commission as they undertake this monumental task of sorting through thousands and thousands of pages of comments that have come in. It's not the beginning of the end, and it's really not even the end of the beginning. It's just the beginning of the beginning for a long process ahead of us, so much more to go. But thank you everybody here for being here today. This is the end of our program portion. We do have lunch, so hopefully people will be able to stick around for that. And that's the end of the fall meeting.